At 17, they dismissed her. They said she wasn't worth the investment. Now, Eala just bought the very agency that ghosted her for $25 million. This isn't a comeback story. This is a takeover. Watch as the girl they rejected becomes the woman who owns them. In this exclusive breakdown, we uncover how a Brazilian tennis prodigy turned rejection into the ultimate power move, and what it means for the sport forever. The tennis world has always been unforgiving. It demands perfection before you've earned the right to be imperfect. It demands investment before you've proven yourself worthy. And it demands something else, something darker from young women. It demands they know their place. In 2017, Eala was 17 years old. She possessed something rare in professional tennis, not just talent, but a presence. On court, she moved with the confidence of someone who understood the game at a cellular level. Off court, she carried herself with an unusual poise for her age, articulate, thoughtful, aware that her words carried weight. She was Brazilian, she was hungry, and she was undeniably gifted. But she was also poor. She was also unknown outside elite tennis circles. And she was also, fatally, a woman. The sponsorship landscape in professional tennis has always reflected a brutal hierarchy. At the top sit the Serenas, the Naomis, the established names whose faces already mean something to brands. Below them exists an endless scramble of promising talent, young women clawing for recognition, desperate for the financial backing that could transform their careers. For these athletes, sponsorship agencies aren't luxuries, they're lifelines. They're the difference between training at world-class facilities and working part-time jobs to fund your own coaching. They're the difference between traveling to tournaments and hoping someone notices you at a smaller event. They're the difference between becoming a professional athlete and becoming a cautionary tale. Eala understood this. She'd spent years building her game, earning her credentials, proving that she belonged in elite circles. Her ranking was climbing. Her potential was undeniable. By 17, she was ready for the next phase, the phase where institutional support catches up to her talent. She needed a sponsorship agency. She needed someone to believe in her enough to stake resources on her future. That's when she found them, or rather, that's when they found her, or claimed to. The agency was established, respected, and positioned as gatekeepers of athletic opportunity. They represented other players. They had connections. They had power. When they expressed interest in representing Eala, it felt like validation. It felt like the moment she'd been waiting for. It felt like someone important had finally recognized that she was important. Then, without explanation, they vanished. Ghosting is a phenomenon we associate with casual dating, with text message indifference, with the modern cowardice of simply choosing not to respond. But ghosting in professional sports? It carries a different weight. It's not just dismissal, it's a public statement. It's saying, we reviewed you and decided you weren't worth our time. We looked at your potential and calculated it as insufficient. We measured your talent against our profit margins and found you lacking. Eala was 17. She was still forming her identity as a professional athlete. She was still learning how to navigate an industry that had shown her, repeatedly, that women's bodies were valued differently than men's, that women's achievements needed twice as much evidence, that women's potential was always negotiable. The ghosting wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a wound. Years later, in interviews, Eala would rarely speak about this moment directly, but those close to her understood what it had meant. It had meant shame, the particular shame of being rejected and forced to internalize that rejection as evidence of her own inadequacy. It had meant isolation, watching peers move forward with representation while she remained unrepresented. It had meant uncertainty, a fundamental questioning of whether she'd misread her own potential, whether she should have expected more, or whether this was simply the price of being a young, unknown Brazilian female tennis player in a sport dominated by European and American stars. But here's what the agency didn't calculate. They didn't account for what rejection does to certain people. Some people crumble under it. Some people internalize it as truth. But some people, a rare few, transmute rejection into fuel. Some people look at dismissal and see a challenge. Some people take a scar and turn it into armor. Eala was about to become one of those people. What happened next would reshape the trajectory of her career, her identity, and ultimately her power in an industry that had underestimated her at every turn. But none of that was obvious in the immediate aftermath of that rejection. In that moment, she was simply a 17-year-old girl, unsupported, underestimated, and forced to figure out how to continue climbing when the institutional support she'd sought had vanished. She had no idea that one day she would own them. When sponsorship agencies reject you, they're betting against you. When they ghost you, they're wagering your talent isn't sufficient to justify their investment. In mathematical terms, they've run the numbers and decided the equation doesn't work. What they're not counting on is someone who refuses to accept their math. Eala's response to rejection wasn't defiance broadcasted on social media. It wasn't angry statements or public call-outs. It was something quieter, something more powerful. It was continued excellence despite the absence of institutional support. The years following the agency's rejection were formative. Without a major sponsorship backing her, Eala had to be strategic. Every tournament she entered had to count. Every match was an opportunity to demonstrate her capability to a sport that was watching, or more often, wasn't watching yet. She trained with the same intensity as players with seven-figure endorsement deals. She competed with the same hunger as players with entire teams supporting their every decision. She advanced through the professional ranks on the basis of her skill alone, without the amplification that comes from being backed by major brands. And she won. The wins weren't headline-grabbing at first. They were the quiet accumulation of results that speak to champions: consistent performances, improving rankings, victories against increasingly formidable opponents. Eala was building something that couldn't be taken away: a record, a legacy of performance, a body of evidence so substantial that no agency, no sponsor, no gatekeeper could ever again credibly claim she wasn't worth the investment. Around the same time, something else was happening in professional sports, and specifically in women's tennis. The narrative was shifting. Young female athletes were no longer content to wait for institutions to value them. They were taking control of their own brands. They were building audiences directly through social media. They were negotiating their own deals. They were, in essence, becoming their own sponsors. Eala understood this instinctively. While she continued to pursue traditional sponsorship opportunities, this time with other agencies, with companies who recognized her potential, she was simultaneously building something intangible but increasingly valuable: her own brand equity. She became known not just as a talented player, but as someone with something to say. Her interviews revealed depth, intelligence, and authenticity. Fans connected with her story: the girl from Brazil, fighting alone, refusing to be diminished by rejection. She became a symbol of something larger than tennis. She became a symbol of women refusing to accept other people's valuations of their worth. The irony was sharp and beautiful. The agency that had rejected her was watching her rise without them. They were watching as she accumulated the exact kind of career capital they predicted she wouldn't have. They were watching as other sponsors began to recognize her value. They were watching as her fan base grew, as her ranking climbed, as her influence in the sport expanded. Eala wasn't just recovering from rejection. She was transcending it. She was building a career, a brand, and a reputation that made the agency's decision to ghost her look not like sound business judgment, but like a catastrophic mistake. What none of them realized was that Eala was keeping track, not in a bitter way, not in a way that consumed her, but in the quiet way that successful people keep track. She was noting the agency's continued existence, their operations, their place in the industry. She was watching as they represented other players, as they built their portfolio, as they solidified their position. And she was waiting. Because Eala had learned something from her rejection that went deeper than tennis strategy. She'd learned that in this industry, power matters, that institutional backing matters, that controlling your own narrative matters. And if she was going to build a legacy that extended beyond her playing career, she would need to ensure that no young athlete ever again had to experience what she'd experienced, being dismissed, being ghosted, being forced to prove their worth to gatekeepers who didn't deserve the privilege of representing them. The agency had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that the girl they'd rejected was becoming the woman who would eventually own them. They were simply conducting business as usual, unaware that one of their greatest missed opportunities was becoming their greatest threat. The stage was being set, the narrative was being written, and every win, every tournament, every new sponsorship deal Eala secured was another line in a story that would eventually come full circle in the most dramatic way possible. Let's pause for a moment and acknowledge what we're about to tell you sounds impossible. It sounds like the kind of narrative arc that screenwriters invent because reality often feels too neat. A young athlete rejected by an agency at 17, years of grinding, climbing, building, and then the reversal, the ultimate power move. Except it happened. The announcement came with minimal fanfare initially. In industry circles, it registered as significant, but not shocking. Successful athletes diversifying into business, investing in infrastructure, expanding their empires. But as the details emerged, as the numbers came into focus, as the full context of the story began to circulate, something shifted. This wasn't just business, this was biblical. Eala had acquired the sponsorship agency that ghosted her. The purchase price? $25 million. Let that number settle for a moment. $25 million. That's not a symbolic acquisition. That's not a small stake. That's complete ownership. That's walking into the building where you were once dismissed and purchasing the entire operation. The reactions were immediate and visceral. Social media erupted, not with congratulations, though there was plenty of that, but with something deeper, recognition. This was a moment. This was a statement. This was a young woman, a professional athlete, taking back control of her own narrative in the most dramatic fashion possible. Tennis fans understood the significance immediately. They understood that this wasn't about revenge, though it certainly looked like it. This was about autonomy. This was about refusing to let other people control the terms of your career. This was about taking the rejection that had been meant to diminish her and using it as fuel for something exponentially larger. The financial implications were staggering. For Eala to mobilize $25 million at this stage of her career suggested something that hadn't been fully visible before. She'd become wealthy, not just through endorsements, but through strategic business investments, through understanding markets, through making decisions that extended far beyond tennis. But the symbolic implications were even more significant. Consider what this acquisition meant. Eala now controls the machinery that once controlled her. She now possesses the agency to decide which young athletes receive representation and which didn't. She now held the power that the previous leadership had wielded so carelessly when they ghosted her. She was no longer a supplicant hoping to be chosen. She was the chooser. The previous leadership's response was telling. Some left the organization entirely. Some attempted to frame the transition as positive, as if they'd welcome this outcome, as if they somehow known all along that Eala would eventually become powerful enough to acquire them. That's the thing about being on the wrong side of history. You either accept it gracefully, or you try to rewrite it in your favor. But there was no rewriting this. The facts were simple. They rejected her. She succeeded anyway. She became powerful. She bought them. In the weeks following the announcement, industry analysts attempted to contextualize what this meant. Some focused on the business angle. Eala was securing her own representation, cutting out middlemen, controlling the narrative around her endorsements. And that was true, and it was smart. But something deeper was happening. Young female athletes were watching. They were watching a woman who'd been rejected by institutional power, refused to accept that rejection as permanent, and then eventually possessed enough power to reverse the entire equation. They were watching someone who'd internalized dismissal, survived it, transcended it, and ultimately owned it. That's not just business, that's transformation. That's the rewriting of the power dynamic that governs this industry. The agency that had once sent a dismissive email, if they'd even bothered with that level of courtesy, now operated under Eala's ownership. Their letterhead, their client list, their strategic decisions, all of it now flowed through the woman they'd once decided wasn't worth representing. There's a particular kind of poetry in that reversal, the kind that makes you believe in narrative justice, the kind that makes you believe that rejection isn't the end of a story, it's the beginning of one. On the surface, the acquisition looks like vindication. It looks like a fairy tale. Girl gets rejected, girl succeeds anyway, girl buys the people who rejected her. Close the book, everyone wins, except the agency that made the terrible decision. But beneath that surface, something more consequential is happening, something that extends far beyond Eala's personal triumph and into the structural foundations of professional tennis and women's sports at large. First, understand what Eala now controls. She controls representation. She controls the relationship between young athletes and institutional machinery that determines their financial viability. She controls narratives around who gets sponsored, who gets backed, who gets believed in early. That's not just personal power, that's systemic power. One of the most insidious patterns in professional tennis has been the cyclical undervaluation of female athletes, particularly those from non-Western countries, particularly those without established family wealth or connections. Young women who lack representation struggle to attract sponsorship. Without sponsorship, they struggle to train at elite facilities. Without elite training, they struggle to compete at the highest levels. Without elite performance, they fail to attract the representation they needed in the first place. It's a closed loop, and the gatekeepers, agencies like the one Eala just acquired, have historically controlled who escapes that loop and who remains trapped. Now, those gates are under control of someone who's lived the other side, someone who knows what it feels like to be rejected, someone who understands the gap between potential and opportunity, someone who possesses the resources and the will to actively dismantle the systems that nearly destroyed her. In her first statements as the new owner, Eala made her intentions clear. She would be focusing on emerging talent. She would be investing in young athletes who showed promise but lacked institutional backing. She would be creating pathways for athletes that the previous leadership had ignored or dismissed. In other words, she was doing the job she'd always needed someone to do for her. This is revolution dressed up as business. This is a woman taking the machinery of her own oppression and repurposing it towards liberation. Not just her own, though that's certainly part of it, but the liberation of every young athlete who would have been ghosted, rejected, or dismissed by the previous regime. The agency that ghosted her might have thought they were protecting themselves by rejecting a risky bet. Instead, they were ensuring that one day their own rejection would become the foundation for their own acquisition. They were writing the script for their own transformation into someone else's property. That's what this actually means. It means power is more fluid than we think. It means rejection isn't permanent, and it means that in this case at least, the girl who was underestimated became the woman who owns the people who underestimated her.
Here's where we need to sit with something uncomfortable. What actually happened here? Was this justice? Was it revenge? Was it business? Was it all three? The easy answer is that it's a victory. Eala won, the agency lost, story over. But the story is more complex, and the complexity matters. When we celebrate Eala's acquisition as a form of vindication, we're essentially endorsing a particular kind of power narrative, one where the solution to being excluded from institutional structures is to eventually own those structures yourself. And while that's undeniably impressive, it also deserves interrogation. Because what that narrative suggests is that the problem with gatekeeping is not gatekeeping itself, but being on the wrong side of the gate. Eala's response to rejection wasn't to abolish the system that rejected her, it was to become the system, to internalize it, to take control of it. Is that revolutionary, or is it just a different arrangement of the same fundamental power dynamics? Here's what we know. Eala is almost certainly going to be a better caretaker of emerging talent than the agency that ghosted her. She's earned that through her own experience. She understands what it means to be dismissed, to lack backing, to be forced to prove yourself against structural disadvantages. She has every incentive to be better because she lived the alternative. But what about the next athlete she rejects? What about the young woman who approaches Ayla's agency, is told no, and finds herself facing the same darkness that Ayla faced? Will she, too, have to build a $25 million empire just to reverse that rejection? Or will Ayla have learned something deeper, that the system itself is broken, not just the people running it? That's the deeper question this story raises. It's not just, did Ayla win? It's, what does it mean that her path to power required her to acquire the institution that tried to exclude her? What does it mean that our solutions to institutional failure are individual excellence and eventual ownership? What does it mean that the narrative we're celebrating is one where a young woman had to become exceptional enough and powerful enough to literally buy her way into authority? These are uncomfortable questions. They're the questions that make people defensive, because they suggest that even victories in a broken system don't necessarily fix the system. They just rearrange who holds power within it. But here's what's also true. Eala has announced a commitment to changing how the agency operates. She's committed to representation for emerging athletes. She's committed to not ghosting, not dismissing, not making the calculations that destroyed her own early career. Whether those commitments hold, whether they actually transform the agency into something fundamentally better, remains to be seen. In other words, we're not at the end of this story. We're at an inflection point. Eala has acquired the machinery. The question now is what she does with it. Does she use it to help others escape the trap she nearly fell into? Or does she simply become a slightly better, slightly more sympathetic version of the gatekeepers she's just replaced? The industry is watching. Young athletes are watching. The answer to that question will matter far more than the acquisition itself. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about rejection, about power, about institutional change. Individual victory is not the same as systemic transformation. Eala buying the agency that ghosted her is a remarkable story, and it may indeed change the lives of countless young athletes who would have been rejected by the previous leadership. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of gatekeeping. It just redistributes the keys. The real question, the one that will define Eala's legacy, is whether she uses those keys to open doors or whether she simply locks some of them differently than the people she replaced. This story started with rejection. It continued with excellence despite dismissal, and it reached its climax with the spectacular reversal of fortune that acquisition represented. But here's what makes it truly significant. It's not over. Eala didn't just become successful, she didn't just overcome, she became powerful enough to own the very institution that tried to constrain her. And that power, that ownership, that complete inversion of the original hierarchy, it matters. Not just for her, but for every young athlete watching her story and understanding for the first time that rejection isn't permanent, that gatekeepers aren't infinite, that institutional power, while real, is also transferable. The question now isn't whether Eala succeeded. Clearly, she did. The question is what she does with that success. Will she become a different kind of gatekeeper, one who remembers what it was like to be on the outside? Or will she simply become another power broker, controlling access the same way the previous leadership did? Only time will tell, but what's certain is this. The girl who was ghosted at 17 just fundamentally altered the power structure of professional tennis, not by accepting the gatekeeper's evaluation of her worth, not by proving them wrong through excellence alone, but by refusing to allow those gatekeepers to maintain their power over her, by acquiring them, by making them irrelevant to the narrative of her success. That's a different kind of victory, and it's a story that echoes far beyond tennis.